where he is the principal investigator of the Bioacoustics Lab. He studies the sensory physiology and behavioral ecology of marine animals with a focus on sound production to better understand how they navigate in their environment, how they find prey, avoid predators, and communicate with one another. His focus is on toothed whale species. He is a co-investigator of the Dominica Sperm Whale Project, which is a long-term study on sperm whales in the Caribbean. And thanks to the research from this project, we now have a much better understanding of the life history and behavioral ecology of sperm whales. Today, he will be presenting on the sensory and behavioral ecology of beaked whales. So without further ado, please give Professor Mattsson a warm virtual welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored that I get the opportunity to contribute to your very nice seminar series. And obviously, I would have loved to show up in person, but the world does not allow for that these days. So I'm very excited to be able to do this on Zoom. We have tested the videos and the sound, and I'm hopeful that you can keep track. If not, then just write a message or just unmute and ask me a question as we go. I hope there'll be time for questions afterwards. So basically, my lab, and thank you very much for the nice introduction. My lab is concerned with how animals use sound to find food, to navigate, and to communicate, and how that process is affected by human activities. More specifically, I'm very excited about understanding how some animals use echolocation to capture food under conditions of poor lighting. And in particular, we try to span a very broad research field by both studying very small bats in air and also studying deep diving toothed whales as they go into mesopelagic depth to find their food. And this is a picture of one of our study animals along with a tooth from one of our other study animals. So this is a little Daubenton's bat with a mealworm in its mouth sitting on a medium-sized tooth of a sperm whale. So that's just to give you an appreciation over the size scale over which animals actually echolocate. So it's at least over 6 orders of magnitude in weight. And I find that deeply fascinating to look at the scaling implications of how animals can use sound to find food by listening to echoes of self-emitted sounds that are sort of reflected off prey targets in the wild. In the context of today's seminar, I want to highlight some of the research that we are doing here in Aarhus that is more specifically concerned with basically how very large marine mammals get food into their mouth, both in terms of how they employ sensory means to find it, but also how they biomechanically are able to capture it, and then finally also how much food they actually need to pay for their life histories. And this is an example of some of the study species that we work with: bowheads to the upper left, humpback whales a lot to the upper right, sperm whales to the lower left, and then the beaked whales to the lower right. That is the topic of the talk today. Now, the deep diving whales in particular face the issue that there's a spatial decoupling between two vital resources, namely oxygen at the surface and food at depth. And this is an example of a blameless beaked whale diving to feed at depths between 600 and 1200 meters in what we call the mesopelagic zone. And that basically means that they must access both of these resources, but there's on the order of 500 to 700 meters between these two resources. So when they move between these two, there will be a cost of transport. So that spatial decoupling is something they must negotiate in their biology and in the way that they have evolved and in the way that they generally deal with problems such as finding food and avoiding predators and so on and so forth. In particular, if those transport costs mean that they can't dive all the time, then there'll also be periods or epochs between the dives where they cannot feed. And in those epochs, you might want to imagine that they will spend a lot of time at the surface, but they may not want to do that because of a predation pressure. So there's a lot at play here. And in as much as I'm basically a professor of sensory physiology, I'm very much intrigued by the whole picture of what it takes to be an air-breathing animal that has to dive to depth to find food. So I sort of, in as much as this figure is quite primitive, I very much consider this a driving principle for a lot of the questions that we're asking in my lab. Now, the ecosystem that the animals that I'll be talking about today are basically targeting as predators is what can broadly be defined as a deep scattering layer. And some people claim, and I agree with them, that this is the biggest ecosystem on the planet. So it's enormous biomass made up of myctophids, a range of cephalopods, some shrimp, and other crustaceans that are making up a massive biomass in many of the deeper parts of the world's oceans, where you find very little food and in epipelagic waters. And that means that if you want to feed in those areas, you have to be able to dive deep to basically access this food resource if you're an air-breathing animal. Now, very interestingly, on the order of 25 species of large toothed whales and a few pinnipeds, such as elephant seals, have evolved to be able to forage in this food layer. And I find it uniquely interesting to try to understand their physiology and also their sensory ecology in terms of how they go about finding food down there. We know that there is potentially a lot of biomass, but the energy content of these individual prey items will, from net toes, they do indeed appear to be very variable. And we also know very little about how these deep diving predators actually find the valuable prey at these depths, and what sort of trade-offs they are basically negotiating when making decisions about how long to stay down there and whether to chase escaping prey and so on and so forth. This is their world: pitch darkness and 4 degrees Celsius and a very high pressure. And they must be able to breath hold for a long time to be able to find food under these conditions. And we as humans would not last very long if we were supposed to spend any time there, and certainly not be able to find and basically catch any food, I'm sure. However, there are some theories about how deep diving air breathers may go about finding food in this mesopelagic food layer, or the deep scattering layer. And the most prevalent theories deal with the fact that all oxygen is produced at the surface from basic photosynthesis, and then there can be some water mass movements that will bring oxygen to deeper depths. But because there's a large biomass down there that's basically respiring, then the oxygen is consumed and there's not really any oxygen produced. So in some parts of the deep scattering layer, in some parts of the world, we will find what is called the oxygen minimum zone, where the partial pressure of oxygen can be very low. And the idea is then that prey items or animals in that layer will be very slow moving because their metabolism cannot basically be supported because there's very little oxygen. Secondly, there's also been arguments that because they are not close to the surface where there's a lot of basic predators that use their eyes for hunting, then there's a relaxed predation pressure on them, so that they can evolutionarily let go of basic muscle mass and basically turn into more or less sit and wait predators with a very small muscle mass. And that means that if you're a deep diving animal, such as a beaked whale or a sperm whale or an elephant seal, as long as you can get down there, you sort of have an easier walk in the park, because your prey will be very slow moving because of low oxygen and because of a fairly low sort of capability to escape you. That has sort of been the notion for the last 20, 30 basic years about what's happening. But essentially, we don't know. And interestingly, when you're supposed to find food at these depths, because there's no light, you can't use what sensory systems normally do, namely that you rely on intrinsic energy from the environment. Rather, some of these animals are either relying on hydrodynamic cues and in some cases also very dim light via basic light producing organs in some of these fish and squids, such as elephant seals that can target these, or you have to employ echolocation, as is the case for toothed whales. And this is a nice scan of a porpoise that we studied a lot in Denmark, and this is just to give you a brief introduction to how toothed whales actively use sound to hunt. They produce sound in their nasal complex. I hope you can see my mouse now, just below the blowhole. A click is then made that propagates through the fatty melon, which is this yellow structure. The click is propagating through the water. It hits the target. A very small fraction of that energy is reflected off the target, and then it propagates back to the lower jaw of the animal, and then the sound energy is ducted back to the inner ears, and then the animal is generating an acoustic image of its basic surroundings that is updated for every time it emits a click. So essentially, toothed whales are basically extracting information from the environment and from its target by estimating target range from the delay between the outgoing click and the returning echo, and they estimate target size from the level, the loudness of the returning echo, and the duration of it. And then via acute auditory processing, they can also deduce something about target properties from the echo time frequency structure. And toothed whales are very, very good at this. In fact, better than any human sonar at fairly short ranges. And some of the things that we're also very much engaged in and try to understand in detail how echolocation is working. And luckily, we have trained and captive porpoises at a facility here in Denmark. And I just want to give you a video of a fundamental part of what it is to be an echolocating toothed whale. So in this case, I'm showing you. The video is not playing. Let me give that a go again. Interesting. Let me just see if I can forward this. Let me try with this video then. Well, 10 minutes ago when we tried it, it worked. That's interesting. Either way, what I would have shown you is that when the porpoise swim towards a fish target here, they will click faster and faster and faster until they eventually end up making a very fast click train that we call a buzz. And that buzz is universal for all echolocating toothed whales that we've been studying. So basically, they use an acoustic version of a stroboscope light at the end, so they get a lot of fast, rapid updates on where their prey is in the final stages of capture. And they're very good at this. So this is an example of a blindfolded porpoise with suction cups on its eyes that can tell the difference acoustically between two identical spheres. They are exactly of the same size, the same dimensions, and one is made of aluminum and one is made of steel, and the porpoise can 99 out of 100 times tell the difference from the echoes that's coming back here. Now, I find that process very interesting from a sensory physiology point of view, but it's also an ecologically very important one. So some conservative estimates that we've done in a manuscript that's soon to be submitted is that echolocating toothed whales are responsible for a biomass turnover in marine ecosystems that are at least 2 times higher than that of combined basic human fisheries. So these animals are very important apex predators that are exerting significant top-down effects on the ecosystem basically in which they hunt. No matter where they are, whether they are basically river dolphins in the Amazon or deep diving toothed whales that we will talk about today, they do play an important role as ecosystem engineers. Now, the topic of today's talk is a strange group of these toothed whales, namely what is called the beaked whales. And what's interesting about them is that they are large predators. There's more than 20 species of relevant-sized basic marine predators, and up until something like 15, 20 years ago, absolutely nothing was known about them other than some basic anatomy from strandings and something about stomach contents. In that sense, all I can say is if you're an aspiring biology student, do not study beaked whales because they are the worst animals ever to work with. And I'll show you a lot of nice photos today, and I took none of them. And this is my best photo of a beaked whale. And it's not only a telltale to the fact that I'm not a good photographer, but also to the fact that these animals spend very little time at the surface, and that they are very, very difficult to study because they live in the blue waters of the world, deep diving, very cryptic animals. And yet they are very fascinating. This is a picture that was taken 16 years ago of what is called the Longman's beaked whale, which is a large 7-8 meter beaked whale that lives in the Indian Ocean. At the time, this was the first basic color photo taken of the species. And in the Pacific, there's a lot of evidence from DNA samples to suggest that there's at least one and possibly two species of beaked whales that we haven't even identified yet. And I find that very, very fascinating that we can have elephant-sized basic predators out there in the oceans that we still don't even have a proper photo of or understand anything about in terms of their basic biology. I personally think that beaked whales could have stayed sort of in the dark and hiding and out of the view of biologists and scientists for a long time, if it wasn't for the fact that in the 90s there was a lot of attention via a Nature paper about potential Navy-induced strandings of some of these animals, and that led to an enormous push to try to understand in the early 2000s about the mechanisms behind possible sonar-induced strandings. And when I was a postdoc in Peter Tajek's lab almost 20 years ago, that there was a large research basic thrust initiated to try to understand why beaked whales would respond this way to sound in terms of decompression, sickness, behavioral effects, and so on and so forth. But one of the fundamental things that we quite quickly realized is that we need to understand the basic biology of these animals before you can start understanding why and how they may respond to some of these sounds. So I've had the undivided pleasure ever since being in Tajek's lab to try to understand the biology of these very basic cryptic animals that have a tendency of ending up on the beach when there's a Navy sonar exercise. I want to highlight two of my very close friends and colleagues before I go on to show some of our data, and that's Mark Johnson to the right, who's the inventor of the DTAG, a much used device to put on whales with suction cups that can tell us a lot about their biology. And also to the left, we have a very good friend, Natasha Aguilar from the Canary Islands, and I've spent a lot of time with both of them in the field trying to understand the biology of these animals, and a lot of what I'm going to present today is certainly just as much their work as mine. Now, when you move up to these animals, as some of the audience can testify, because you've also worked with, for example, the Cuvier's beaked whales, or basically off Cape Hatteras, if I remember correctly, one have to be very patient when you work with beaked whales. So you have to sneak up on them slowly, in this case with a tagging pole and one of these DTAGs. And then in many of the cases where you get this close, they just dive and you never see them again. But in a few cases, you get close enough and then you can place a DTAG on them, and hopefully it stays on for a long time and can tell us a lot about what these animals are doing. When the tag then comes off, it floats back to the surface and then we can recover it. And I just want to show you this slide just to give you an impression about the amount of work it takes to put these DTAGs on. A part of it was also a learning process, but on average, we basically tag a beaked whale every 10 to 12 days of field work. And the 18 good tags that we put out has basically taken something like 10 years to deploy and also get back. So it has been a lot of work, but it's actually also turned out to be very instructive in terms of understanding the biology of these animals. So let's have a look at their basic diving behavior. What is unique about beaked whales, in this case a Cuvier's beaked whale, is that they can dive for very long and they can dive very deep. And this is one example. We can see two 19-minute dives followed by some shorter dives, 1 to 700 meters and 1 to 2,000 meters. And I recently read the nice JB paper by some of you guys where it was suggested that they can dive super deep and also hold their breath potentially for a very long time. And I'm looking forward to some fun discussions about whether they are generally going beyond their aerobic dive limit or not. But let's not go there now. Bottom line is that they make long and deep dives to access meso and bathypelagic food. If we look at their overall acoustic and diving behavior, here we see a dive profile, time of the day on the x-axis and dive depth on the y-axis. What you'll see is that they start clicking at a depth of 400 to 500 meters. And when they hit something like 600 meters, they start emitting those basic buzzes that I mentioned before for the porpoise, that are telltales to the fact that they're trying to intercept a prey. And we can then look at the distribution of the buzzes. You can see prey interception basically happens from between 600 to 1300 meters depth. What's very fascinating is that, as far as we can tell, they don't make any sounds whatsoever at depths shallower than something like 400 meters. And that's very interesting, because if you look at sperm whales or dolphins or pilot whales that can also dive deep, they are very vocal also at the surface. But beaked whales in general seem to be, at least this is a plain whale's beaked whale, seem to be very silent at depths shallower than 400 meters. And interestingly, you wonder then, where do they then mediate any sort of acoustically induced social interactions? And in fact, work by Natasha has shown that male plain whales, beaked whales, actually make tonal sounds, sort of fairly high frequency, short sort of whistles, at depth between 400 and 1500 meters. And we have one example of where there's a lot of these sounds being produced, and we can hear that the whales are rubbing up against each other at a depth of 1500 meters. So it seems that sort of the vocal exchanges and communication may happen at extreme depth, and there's basically nothing going on at shallower depths. It's not that they're not touching each other or that they're together. It's just that they are consistently silent when they're at shallow depth. And we have been, along with others, been proponents of the idea that this is a form of acoustic crypsis to avoid predation from killer whales. And in a paper that came out basically this year, we proposed that this acoustic behavior is to avoid interception by killer whales. And sometimes it does indeed happen that a pod of killer whales will stumble on them, and that often leads to the death of these beaked whales, in as much as they're not that much smaller than basically a killer whale. What we showed in the paper by Natasha is that when we have two beaked whales, in this case, that are diving down to feed, they're echolocating and they're catching prey, but when they stop echolocating, they don't just go straight back to the surface. They actually have a slow meandering ascent back to the surface that basically make them appear or make them come to the surface sometimes a kilometer away from where an eavesdropper would have heard them click the last time. And that greatly reduces the risk of interception by a predator that might be basically tracking them from the surface acoustically. And this is what Mark Johnson calls a harlequin plot, where we can see how they consistently never turn in the same direction when they are ascending. So it appears that when they are clicking, they spread out to forage, then the group comes together, then they ascend to the surface together, but in a random direction, very likely to avoid interception by killer whales. So I think a lot of the diving behavior in particular, and also the acoustic behavior, can be understood in the context of trying to avoid interception by these basic large super killer whales. Now, if we look in more detail at their echolocation behavior, we find that they make 22 of these buzzes per dive. This is again plain whales, beaked whales, but that the duty cycle is quite low. So they only spend about 20% of their time in the food layer. So whatever food they need must be caught in 20% of their of the 24 hours of a day. What is interesting is that they apparently live in areas where the food density is high enough that when they make it to the deep scattering layer, they on average encounter a prey item every 30 seconds. If we then look at the echolocation behavior, so here we plotted the interclick intervals, the intervals between each of the clicks. You can see the buzzes down here, and this is a stable search clicks. Then they produce on the order of 3,500 clicks per dive. And those 3,500 clicks then both involve the usual FM clicks that they use for search, but also the buzz clicks that they use to intercept their prey. And if we look at just the the search click, these frequency modulated clicks, you'll see that these are the number of clicks that they invest between having tried to intercept one prey and then until they have searched for, approached, and then tried to capture another one. So on average, they only use less than 100 clicks to search for, home in on, and then initiate a capture process of a prey item. And I find that quite remarkable that they, with just 90 clicks on average, and therefore on average 90 echoes, can both find and basically intercept a prey item. So I think this is a very interesting finding, in the sense that if you ask a Navy dolphin to solve a detection or discrimination task in shallow water in a hoop, they can use hundreds of clicks to try to reach a decision on whether there's a mine out there or not. But when animals are actually diving deep while breath holding, they don't have the luxury of doing that, and then they can actually be quite frugal and be able to be super efficient by producing very few clicks to actually find their prey items. Now, if we look in detail at a prey capture, I can try play it for you. So now you can hear a ticking sound, I hope. And this is a beak whale that's sort of swimming down. It's a pseudo track, and then it initiates a buzz. And then there's sort of an impact sound at the end of the buzz where prey is very likely intercepted. So when we started looking at this 15 years ago, we sort of had a pretty good idea about the fact that these buzzes were in fact involved in prey interception. But very interestingly, the D-tag placed on a Blainville's beak whale was made so sensitive by Mark Johnson that not only could we record the outgoing clicks, as you can see here, as sticks, and this is then the fast click train of a buzz, but also when we zoomed in on them, we could actually not only see the outgoing click, but also the returning echoes from prey. And I still remember that autumn evening in Woods Hole when we first discovered this. I find that very sort of magic, because from a sensory physiology point of view, it's sort of a wet dream that we can sort of tap into the sensory streams coming back to wild animals. And we have harnessed that potential in quite a lot of animals now, in particular recently porpoises. But it all started with these beak whales where we recorded these first prey echoes. And that allowed us to show that indeed these prey echoes, the delay to these prey echoes is getting shorter and shorter, in basic keeping with the fact that the distance to them is also getting shorter and shorter. And when the beak whale is something like 2-3 meters from the prey item, the buzz has been initiated, and that made us conclude that these beak whales essentially is using more or less the same behavior as echolocating bats that are also using slow sampling, and then when they're close enough to their prey, they will also switch to a buzz where they emit their ultrasonic cries very, very fast to guide motor updates for capture. Now, these echoes, that's fine. We can measure the echo strength and so on and so forth, but Mark came up with a very ingenious way of displaying these predator-prey interactions between deep diving whales and their prey. And what he figured is that we could sort of basically make a fish finder plot out of these click echo pairs. So now imagine that we have an outgoing click recorded by the tag of the animal, and then with some delay we have echoes arriving from, in this case, 2 prey items. If we then color code the magnitude of the click as a function of delay and therefore range to the returning echoes that we can also color code the strength of, then we can do that for each click. So the second click, now the whale has come closer to the prey target, we can make another bar, and so on and so forth. And then Mark flipped those, and basically each of these lines here is then a click with a corresponding prey echo coming back. And you can see this is a regular clicking, the tick, 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 tick that you heard before. And then the mee, where they make the buzz, is then this line. And you'll see that the sampling rate of the whale goes up, because you can see that the bin width here gets much, much smaller, because a lot of clicks are produced in rapid succession. And that means that we can track prey items, and prey item in this case out to 11 meters in front of the whale at 1,000 meters depth. And we can track the prey all the way until it's intercepted and eaten. And that allows us to speak to the success rate of the whales. And we find that depending on the strategy that they employ, that they capture somewhere between 80 and 95% of the prey items that they're targeting. So they have a fairly high success rate. But as we shall see later, some of these prey items are in fact also escaping. What's nice about them is that these echograms actually gives us an insight into the detailed predator-prey movements at a resolution that corresponds to 250 frames per second super fast camera. So in fact, we can sort of have these echograms be a visual rendition of some acute acoustic interactions that's happening at 1,000 meters depth. And the nice thing about it is that we are not applying light or anything down there that is affecting the prey. We are just passive listeners of a process of life and death, basically, where a predator is trying to intercept the prey, and then we can just keep track of the temporal and spatial relationship between the predator and its prey. Now, because we can get echoes back at different delays, and because we, in the older tags, have two hydrophones, we can also calculate the angle to these. And therefore, this is an example of where we have taken relative echo strength as a function of angle and range and plotted it. And what this highlights is that the beak whale has a very narrow cone of sound, emitted in front of it that is basically equivalent to the light cone of a flashlight. So they have a narrow acoustic field of view, we call it, in front of them, where they get basically within 20 degrees that they get all of their prey echoes. So the sonar beam forms a very strong spatial filter. But what we have investigated recently is the fact that the animals can actually turn their heads, and they're doing that when they're looking for prey, so they can use that spatial filter in various directions. And what we find in that context is that they can make a decision about whether there's something edible in front of them, basically from the information that comes from 1 or 2 clicks, and then they scan their head to a new piece of water volume and make a decision there. So they're scanning quite fast with respect to how they're clicking, and that shows very clearly that they are very good at making a decision about whether there's something that should be targeted for capture in a particular volume of water, just using very few clicks. And indeed, there's a lot of stuff down there that they are not trying to eat. So this is an example. Now I've flipped the echograms. Now we have the number of clicks emitted here, and this, you can just see this hailstorm or swarm of echoic objects in the deep scattering layer that the whale is passing, but it's not trying to eat it. So in some parts of the deep scattering layer, there's an incredibly high, what we call clutter levels. There's a lot of echoes coming back from objects that is not of interest to the whale. And in other areas outside the deep scattering layer, you can see that the echo streams are much more sparse. And what we've been trying to look at from a more large scale perspective is that, so this is out to 150 meters. You can see there's a strong bottom echo coming here. And then the whale basically is pointing towards the seafloor in this phase, and then it pitches up, and then the sound cone is not hitting the seafloor anymore, and then it more or less disappears. But what's interesting is that we can zoom in on sort of more close range. You can see that the whale is passing an enormous amount of objects, organisms that are giving echoes, but none of these are being targeted for capture until it finally stumbles on something that it decides to go for, and then it initiates a buzz. And our working hypothesis there is that the whales are super selective. We actually find that they ignore more than 95% of the objects that they're insonifying. So they're employing a very selective foraging scheme based on this echolocation information. And some of it is very much implied to suggest that there's a stratification of how the deep scattering layer is composed in terms of species. So you can see here that the whale starts clicking at a depth of 300 meters, and then it starts encountering organisms. Then it's capturing one here. A lot of organisms are encountered, and then it just starts eating a lot of animals here. It ignores some, eats again. These are the bottom echoes. It goes up to the surface in silence, do some bounce dives, and then it does it again. You see at the second dive, it's exactly the same depth, again ignoring a lot of prey items or organisms, and then it really starts eating. And this stratification has been very much enforced recently by work by Kelly Benoit Bird at MBARI, where she's shown that indeed different prey organisms and different organisms in the deep scattering layer are stratified. So it appears that what the beak whales are doing is that they're trying to find a part of the deep scattering layer where the prey items that very likely render the highest energy returns are basically targeted for capture. Now, and this is work by Patricia Arranz, also from the Canary Islands, if you superimpose where prey is caught, you can see that it largely corresponds to echo sound or traces of where the majority of the biomass is in the deep scattering layer. So in this case, with depth between 400 and 600 meters. But what's interesting is that at least off the Canary Islands, there is not really too much of an oxygen minimum zone. The oxygen levels are quite high in this case. So the whales are not necessarily feeding in the densest part of the deep scattering layer, but more that they seem to be finding a layer that is basically composed of the prey items that they are targeting. Not only do they do that in a vertical plane, but this is a bird's eye view of a dive profile of a blainwheel beak whale. So it dives here, you can see the dive depth here. Well, basically it starts clicking here, at 500 meters depth. Then it's capturing one prey item. Then it stumbles on what appears to be a school of prey. It catches quite a bunch of them, moves, finds a new school, catches a lot of them, and then it moves again deeper, a new school, and then moves to a single prey item, and so on and so forth. So it appears that the prey items that they're targeting are not only vertically stratified, but also essentially schooling. And I think, I hope the next 5-10 years we'll get a much better understanding of the composition of the deep scattering layer. Now, what's interesting is that we find that the echolocation behavior of the animal is very much tailored to these different patchiness of the prey. So this is an example of the patches I showed before. So this is a patch, 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 and a patch. Whereas in other cases there is no patchiness. They just seem to just sort of basic regular intervals in encountering prey. And that means that when they're in a patch, they are turning a lot. So this is degrees per second in the blue dots. So when they're in patches, there's a lot of turning, because they keep coming back on the same school of prey. And that means that the time that they spend in a particular water volume, what we call the residence index, is high when they're targeting schooling prey. Whereas when they are just moving along and sort of randomly, apparently encountering prey items that are more evenly spaced, obviously the turning rates are smaller, and when the residence index is similarly also lower. What's interesting is if we look at the interclick intervals, it is seen that when they are turning, when they're not turning very much, they're operating at about 1.4 clicks a second, so about 2.5 clicks per second, or 0.4 second intervals. But when they're turning a lot, they switch to the double mode. So when they're encountering more water volume to this one, they're turning more. They're also sampling faster, very likely to be able to keep up with the encounter rates of new water volumes, and therefore to be able to keep track of where the prey is. So the click rates of a beak whale is actually, it appears, a telltale to how much they're turning at depth. So in a dive where they're not turning as much, you can see that the interclick intervals when they're searching for their prey is sort of stable and high at about 0.4 seconds. And this is one of the few first examples of how echolocating toothed whales are adapting their sampling rates to how they are moving generally within the prey layer, and basically how much they're turning. Now, interestingly, we would like to know at what ranges can they actually detect, not only detect a potential prey item, but also decide that it is prey and also go for it. Because you can imagine some prey items require a particular motor plan to maximize the probability of capture, whereas other prey items require a different tactic. I mean, there's a difference between whether we're supposed to catch a hedgehog or a rabbit or a roadie or whatever. So I think we would also employ different hunting strategies. What's interesting is that we noticed that if we plot the 3D swimming track of beak whales that are moving towards a point in space where they initiate a bus for capture, they come in at a lot of angles. So here we have color coded according to roll. So 180 degrees is belly up, and 0 degrees is dorsal side up. And for some dives, they consistently roll over at quite a long distance. And that sort of stereotyped feeding behavior made us speculate that that will be a proxy for detection of a particular prey item requiring that approach. And if we try plot that, you can see that these are these approaches where they consistently roll over. And it is sort of indicating that somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds before they actually make it to the bus, they have detected a prey item and they have started to roll over on their belly to set themselves up for capture. So that means that not only have they detected their prey at that range, they have also very likely classified it and initiated a motor plan that maximizes the chance of getting hold of that prey. So there's sort of an assertion and an approach phase, and then they basically have somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds between having decided that they want to go for prey until they have to intercept it. And that's quite a long time. I mean, if you compare to a bat, for example, they're flying at high speeds and have a very short range sonar system. So on average, echolocating bats have on the order of half a second between detecting something that might be a prey and then having to intercept it. And that's why if you throw pebbles in the air, you can have hunting bats dive for them, assuming that it's a prey target. So they sort of employ a shoot first, ask afterwards approach, whereas beak whales are sort of very careful, it appears, because they have quite a long time to make decisions because their detection ranges with respect to their swimming speed is quite long. So they make careful, deliberate decisions about whether something is a prey item or not, and that gives them time to set up a particular approach strategy to maximize the chance of capturing that prey. Now, in terms of capture, some of the echograms look exactly like this, right? So that's the one I showed before, so you can see the prey items up to about 10 meters. And basically, this is a whale swimming towards the prey, and the prey is not apparently doing anything. So this closing speed here of about 1.5 meters per second is basically only due to the whale moving towards the target. And the prey is not doing anything, and bam, it's just eaten. We see quite a few of these, and that sort of supports that initial notion that I had when I started the talk, that the beak whales sort of have an easy walk in a low oxygen park, and they're just targeting fairly slow moving and lethargic prey. However, when we started looking in more details at these echograms, we started seeing an example of prey items that certainly didn't just keel over and allow themselves to be eaten. Because here again, you can see a closing speed of the whale of about 1.4 meters per second. And then here, the bus is initiated at a distance of something like 4 to 5 meters. The whale is moving towards the prey, and all by sudden, you can see the echo strength is changing rapidly, suggesting that the prey has changed orientation. And then the prey is actually escaping, jetting away from the whale, and then eventually it's then caught. And what's interesting about it is that there is an acute tracking of this. So this line here and that line here, those are the subsequent bus clicks. So we've time aligned to the bus click, but the next bus click is also plotted. But what you'll see here is that the whale is clicking faster and faster and faster in the bus, but when the prey is escaping, they actually relax their clicking rate and essentially tracking the prey, and then they're reacquiring it again, so that this shows that the whales can actually adjust their clicking rates to the distance that the prey is at if the prey is not escaping too fast. So this is sort of the first example of a very acute vocal tracking of these echolocating predators. Now, sometimes this can lead to protracted chases. So this is again a prey item coming in, and you can see that the whale is buzzing towards it. Then the prey responds to the whale and starts escaping. And this is actually a chase that lasts for 7 seconds before the prey is eventually caught. In some cases, the whales are actually fluking faster to keep up with the prey items. But in general, what we find is that the whales actually, the last 6 meters towards the prey item, they stop fluking. They basically just glide in, not really moving as far as we can tell from the accelerometers of the tag. So they sort of plan an approach angle, and then they just glide slowly towards the prey items. And it's only if the prey sort of really start hauling that the whale is kicking hard, and in some cases then eventually catches it. In other cases, at these 1,000 meters depth, we can see that the whales are aborting the pursuit, very likely to conserve its oxygen, to have a basic longer dive time. Now, what's interesting is that some of these prey items can actually escape very fast. I mean, if you differentiate this escaping prey that we see here, that escapes out to 4 meters, it's actually escaping up to something like 4 meters per second. And the typical prey items of beak whales are sort of 10 to 30 centimeters, up to 40 centimeters in some cases. And that actually means that we have prey items down there that can escape with something like 10 to 15 body lengths per second. And that is more or less equivalent to an honest trout in a stream or salmon. So we have actually prey items in the deep scattering layer that, totally contrary to the hypothesis that they should be slow moving and easy to catch, can really haul ass, basically. So they can move very fast and not make it easy for the beak whales to basically capture them. So yes, some of the prey items down there are lethargic and easy to catch, but there's certainly also active prey, and that was a big basic surprise to us. And that sort of raises a question of how do the prey actually detect that the whales are trying to eat them? Well, many years ago in Woods Hole, we did some experiments with Roger Hanlon where we took squid and had them swim in front of an echo sounder transducer emitting tooth whale-like clicks at source levels of up to 220 dB. And yes, there was mating behavior in front of the transducer, but they were totally oblivious to the ultrasound. And we've done a lot of other experiments showing that there's very little indication that these mesopelagic prey items can in fact detect ultrasound. But what they can detect is the bow wave of the whale. When the whale is moving through the water, it's pushing water ahead of it. And what is true for basically any aquatic animal, whether it be fish or cephalopod or also crustaceans, is that they are very sensitive to that. We've all done the thing you're not supposed to at aquariums, right, where you can go and knock on the glass and go fishy, fishy, donk, donk, and then the fish jump everywhere. And that is basically a response to a particle motion displacement that you generate by hitting the glass. And that is the signature of death underwater. If something is pushing water towards you, that thing is very likely something that will eat you. And if that push happens with a rapid particle acceleration, you can have essentially most aquatic animals do what we call a sea start, a very rapid flinch with the tail, where they move away from that head wave. So this acute sensitivity via the inner ears or the statocyst of these aquatic animals is essentially their means to detect this bow wave. And we speculate that what the prey items are responding to when the beak whales are targeting them is that they are basically being pushed by the water bow wave that the whale is making when they are moving towards them. And that's sort of interesting because when you do deep water net tows in the mesopelagic prey layer on the deep scattering layer, invariably you can only do it quite slowly. So you can tow a net at, say, half a knot or a knot. And that means that whatever is down there that can detect the net, either from a visual cue or from this head wave, the bow wave that I talked about, can essentially escape the net. So the idea that you only have slow moving organisms in the deep scattering layer is because you can only catch slow moving organisms with basic net tows. And I'm sort of very excited about the fact that we've used the beak whales to document that there are indeed quite a lot of organisms down there that can move much faster than what has previously been assumed. And that sort of says not only about the predator-prey interactions between beak whales and the food layer, but also the fact that there are organisms down there with a lot more muscle than the organisms have on average, and also that they very likely have high metabolic rates, which again speaks to biomass turnover and nutrient recycling and a whole lot of other marine ecological basic phenomena. So there's a sampling bias. You can of course also put cameras down there, but again, if you put lights out and put a bait can down, well, you're going to film exactly those species that don't mind the light and that are attracted to the bait cans. All of the animals that are capable of moving and that don't like either of these, you will never see in this way. So in that sense, I think it's very exciting that we can use the predators to actually get a glimpse of a community of fast-moving organisms down there that we didn't even know basically existed. Now, how do whales then, in fact, sort of catch these prey items that can move? Well, what's interesting is that when a prey is being approached and then it changes orientation, what we call a glint, when the prey is responding, it is changing the echo level that is coming back to the whale. And if we plot that change in echo level here, so this blue line is basically just a proxy for the echo level. You can see that it goes from weak to stronger, and therefore this line goes up. If we, along with that, plot what is called the jerk, which is the differentiated acceleration, it's basically a measure of rapid change in acceleration on part of the whale. So this is measured by the tag. You can see that these are closely aligned. So at a point where the whale starts doing something, it's not fluking, but something in its head region, we can also see that the prey is basically responding by changing orientation in the sonar beam. So that these two can serve for proxies for when is the predator doing something in terms of striking towards the prey, and when is the prey actually responding. And that allows us to speak to who is detecting who at what point in terms of this spatial relationship, where the whale really want to get as close as possible before the prey responds, and the prey really want to be able to move when it's being targeted for predation. What we find is that 95% of the buzzes have these significant jerk signatures, where the whale is very likely opening its mouth to generate suction to basically ingest the prey. So we can speak to when they're starting to strike at it. So let's try and have a look at this noble art of what we call hydroacoustic bullfighting, basically. So how are the prey essentially avoiding the predator? Well, it's a little bit like a homicidal chauffeur problem, right? If someone's trying to run you over with a truck, God forbid, then you don't try to run away from the truck. You want to just step aside and let the truck pass you. And that's sort of true for the prey items as well. If they're being targeted by a whale, they should just move to the side out of the sonar beam, and then they should be fine. And in the cases where they successfully escape predation from these animals, I think that's generally what's going on. However, if we look at the timing between when the prey is doing something and when the whale is striking at them, you can see that the time at which the prey is doing something is very closely aligned with when the whale is doing something. So that it appears that the prey is responding to the whale doing something. And the question is, what is that? If the whale is employing suction feeding, and that's what generating that jerk, because it's basically expanding its buccal cavity to suck in water and suck in the prey, that will start accelerating the prey, and maybe that's what it's responding to. And what we can see is that those that are capable of responding early, they have a higher probability of escaping predation. But what's very interesting is that the ranges at which this is occurring is almost a meter. So the median range is 0.8 of a meter. So 0.8 of a meter in front of the whale, the prey is generally starting to act on its predation attempt. What's interesting is that in some cases we see something very interesting. So you have a prey item coming in, here it responds to the whale, but then it actually apparently accelerates directly into the mouth of the whale. The conventional explanation for this is that the whale is employing suction feeding, so that the prey is being sucked into the mouth. But if you talk to people that are very good at fluid dynamics, it's very, very hard to imagine a situation where a whale with a mouth orifice on a yacht of this size can actually generate a water movement that will allow to suck in a prey item of this size over a range, in this case, on the order of 1.5 meters. So how to interpret this? Well, we have a quite controversial proposal that we are airing in a manuscript that is headed by Mark Johnson very soon, namely that the whales are basically tricking their prey. So what we're proposing is that when the whale gets close enough to the prey, in this case about 1.5 meters, it starts sucking gently. But when your prey item is sitting in darkness, you can't really know if you're being pushed or whether you're being pulled. And if in general they're responding by being pushed, by escaping away from a predator coming, so if this is a bow wave and the prey is being pushed, then they escape. Now imagine that the predator comes in at a certain range, but then it opens its mouth just to generate a little bit of suction. That would actually bring the prey a little bit closer to them. But the prey can't tell if it's being pushed or being pulled, so it's actually being given the illusion that it's being pushed from this side, and therefore we are proposing that the whales are actually tricking the animals to actually escape into the mouth of the whale. I have no idea if this is going on because we can't film what's going on at 1,000 meters, but that is at least our working hypothesis, and I'll be interested to see if you have other suggestions of what's going on. So you can see that we plotted quite a few of these, and sort of a range between 1 and 2 meters. It appears that in many cases the prey items are accelerating into the mouth of the whale. And that acceleration into the mouth of the whale is very much timed by the whale doing something with its head and jaw region that we interpret as being a telltale to the fact that it's initiating a gentle suck that actually makes the prey escape in the wrong direction, basically committing suicide. Now, just to wrap up this talk, and thank you for staying on board, I would say that beak whales are sort of the most unlikely animal for understanding sonar-based foraging in the wild. But in the last 15 years, very much prompted by these sonar strandings, we've learned more about how these plain whales, beak whales, echolocate than we know about any other toothed whale echolocating. So Tertiops, for example, that has been in Navy labs for the last 70 years, and from which we know a lot about the sort of basic biosonar capabilities in terms of detecting spheres and targets and discriminating between bronze and steel. We still know very little about how a bottlenose dolphin actually uses echolocation to feed in the wild, and very unlikely, because of these tags, we've actually now basically blamed those beak whales are the white lap rats of understanding biosonar-based foraging in the wild among toothed whales. We're slowly expanding that. We recently recorded prey echoes from sperm whales. We've done it for porpoises and quite a lot of other species. But it is sort of ironic that one of these very elusive and also cryptic animals have been the species where we understand the most about how they use echolocation. So just to give you a few take-home messages, these beak whales, they employ very short but deep and highly selective bouts of foraging, but they only do so less than 20% of their entire time because they have to dive deep and basically recover between these dives. They have a very cryptic behavior that at least we argue can be understood in the context of an anti-predator strategy, where they basically try to keep quiet at depths shallower than 400 meters, and when they are surfacing, they do so in a random direction to avoid that for example, killer whales can eavesdrop on them. And I personally think that the sort of these long-lived, highly case-selected species that only get calves every 5-6 years, as far as we can tell, their main source of mortality is very likely basically predation from killer whales. So they are very, very, very conservative in terms of how to respond to that. And the mid-frequency sonars are evoking responses that are very similar to basic killer whale playback. Has quite a lot of studies by Stacy DeRoot and others shown. So I think the Navy sonar strandings can very much be understood in the context of these anti-predator behaviors. So basically, a Navy sonar, I think, is being perceived as the mother of all killer whales. We've shown that they use surprisingly few clicks on average to find, select, and capture each prey item, and that they can use echo information to carefully select what's a prey and what's not a prey. They deselect most of the organisms that they sonify down there, and that they can adjust their motor patterns to prey types out to ranges of more than 10 meters, allowing them to maximize the chance of success. They catch quite a few of their organisms, the prey that they decide to target, but some prey are escaping along the lines of what I just explained. And this capability of escape is very much in opposition to the existing theories about the fact that the prey should be easier to catch down there. Well, some of the prey is, but there's quite a lot of prey down there that can actually move and has a high muscle mass. And then finally, on a more speculative note, we would like to push the idea that basically beak whales seem to spoof their prey to commit suicide by timing their suction so that the prey is basically being presented with the illusion that they are being pushed rather than being pulled, and then they swim in the direction of the mouth. So if you have lost some of the details of my talk here, I just basically want to say to you that beak whales and bats are essentially doing the same thing when they're hunting under conditions of poor lighting. They use echolocation in a surprisingly similar way. And we know that now because we've actually managed to make now very small DTags for bats that are weighing on the order of 2.5 grams that can go on the back of wild bats when they're hunting in the wild. So in the last year or so, we've been able to make similar inferences about wild bats as we have for these very deep diving mesopelagic predators in the last 15 years. And with that, I would just like to thank you for your attention and thank quite a lot of people that have helped us over the years, particular the folks from Woods Hole, Peter Tyack, Tom Hurst, Alice Brocatelli, Alex Short, and so on and so forth, and a lot of students and also field assistants. And with that, I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Peter. That was very, very interesting. So if you guys have any questions, either raise your hand or write it in the chat. It would be nice to see your face and hear your voice, though, for the questions.
I can understand if you have your minds on other topics in these hours, but I hope I've offered a needed distraction from some of those occupations.
I know we're going to get a chance to talk to Peter later, but I do want to ask one question now before I forget it, Ani, if that's okay. Peter, I know from personal experience how difficult it is to get DTags on B12s. And so I think I might know the answer to the question, but what about social facilitation of foraging in B12s? I mean, they occur in groups, they submerge in groups, they surface in groups. Presumably they're foraging independently when they go down. Very difficult to get more than one DTag in a group. But do you ever get any sense that animals are eavesdropping, or is there anything along those lines?
It's funny you say that because Natasha has just had a manuscript and review in Proceedings of the Royal Society where we are reporting on the few cases where we managed to put 2 DTags on animals in a group, and where we've been able to use the stereo hydrophones to basically get a bearing to the other clicking animals. And what's very interesting is that the whales very much go down together, but as soon as they hit the foraging layer, they spread out and forage independently. In some cases, up to distance of 1,000 meters when we have the 2 tags on animals. And then when they're done foraging, they are getting back together, and then they go back to the surface in a random direction as a group. So I think your question is super interesting. But as far as we can tell, the sort of the cohesion of the group very much have to do with social aspects or anti-predator aspects of it, because as soon as they start foraging and where they sort of what we've coined an acoustic leash on each other so they can hear each other clicking, they immediately fan out. So there's no cooperative foraging as you see in some dolphins, for example, as far as we can tell. And it also appears that they are not eavesdropping on each other. Rather, it seems that they're actually spreading out, perhaps not to sort of interfere with each other's prey fields. We don't have too much data on it, but at least that's the notion right now.
That's very cool. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that my video connection is fine. It was kind of freezing up there for a minute, but since it is now almost 1:20, I think we will say goodbye. But I know, Peter, we're going to meet with you now as the SuperPod Lab. So looking forward to that.
My pleasure.
Thank you.